underneath this. And you will hear they're identical as a transformation from what we heard at the beginning. Continue, please, John. Could actually people hear that the underlying pedal point progression was identical. Now, later on, he varies the pedal points and begins to change key with it, and that's a whole another level of the transfinite in this thing. But that's something. That's the way in which you actually hear this as a coherent transformation. Now, put up the hieroglyphics, will you, please?
They've never heard this before, which we know.
Yeah. Okay. Well, actually, I can play the first variation. I can't play the theme. Can you play the theme, John?
Go back.
Wait, who do you mean?
You want to...
Ricci, go back.
Oh, okay. Just rewind it then, please, to the theme. This ought to make it real clear. Imagine you were some composition student wanting to do what Beethoven did, and you had to write this gobbledygook and say, okay, I'm going to do that. This is the Romovian chord theory that is so studied at universities today.
Romovian?
What's that?
What's that word?
Romovian, after Rameau. Jean-Philippe Rameau is a guy who grew up. They call it functional harmony. It's actually completely dysfunctional. It's good for passing exams. If you want to get out of the conservatory, it's got to function to get you out of the conservatory. But that's not the only thing that it's useful for. Now, I'll just tell you what these little hieroglyphics here mean. The Roman numerals stand for the degree of the scale on which the chord is written. And do we have a blackboard here? We don't have a blackboard. Well, I finally figured out something that's going on with this stuff. This is a perversion of figured bass. Because the numbers you see above here all exist in figured bass. But what Bach did, if you read the books on figured bass by Bach or Mozart, they take a bass line, which is the pedal point line, and they write the figures on that to construct the other voices above the bass line. Now, John has sent me a piece by Emanuel Bach, where he actually turns that into a 4-part choral piece, showing that it's definitely based on vocal, on 4 voices, and on horizontal lines. But the thing that you don't get in figure bass is they're not concerned with this root. I wish I had a blackboard. I thought we'd have one. But if you took a chord C, E, and G, all right, in this Romovian theory, that would be 1 if you were in C. It would be 5 if you were in F, okay? Based on the degree of the scale that it's on. C is the first in C, it's the 5th in F. Simple, right? If you change that from C, E, and G, and put E in the bass, they would call that 1/6. They'd say it's still a C chord, but it's got a different interval. It's got the 6th. And then if you put the G in the bass, they would call it 1/6/4. And they would say, because of different intervals. Now, what the figure bass is never concerned of is this root tone. They're always trying to find because for these guys, the question is it's always a C chord. That's what they're concerned with. For Bach, for Mozart, they would have no concern for that whatsoever. They never even mention it. So for them, the chords are much more of an ephemeral existence, which actually, are constructed over a figured bass. When you're thinking of these root tones, this means that, okay, up to here you're based on C, now you're based on A, C, now you're based on D, G, and when you get down to this stuff, then you really get quite complicated. And the supposed root tone, it changes about 20 times. And if you're thinking that way, you cannot conceive of pedal points. I realize for a lot of people here this doesn't mean anything, but anybody, I see John look at me. That's exactly what it is. It is a completely mystical type of thing. And the proof of its impotence, once again, is you have probably more people in conservatories studying composition now than at any time in history. And they're all studying this, and there's not a damn one of them can write any music. Because you can't write music that way.
Can I just give a real simple example?
Okay, sure.
Just this, right? This. Right, now this, right? This pedal point is going from here to here, right? It's pretty clear.
Right.
But the point is that everybody would say, well, this
1, 6, 4.
this is C,
C, and it's
G,
G.
C,
Exactly.
right? But that's not what's going on.
Yeah.
Right? It's just a pedal point down.
That's right. Exactly. That would be written 1, 6, 4, 5, 7, 1. So that's very good.
Is that related to?
And that's why, you read Mozart's figured bass, you read C.P. Bach's figured bass, they never have this concern with the supposed root of the chord. The chord is just and there's a reason why chords are lawful. You find thirds and fifths and fourths and stuff in it. Chords of a circle are lawful. Draw a circle and make these chords in it. And make the diameter in any half a chord as the geometric mean of the other two sides. You get coherency, but you could never construct a circle from putting a bunch of lines together. You cannot construct a circle from any kind of straight line action. You construct a circle from rotation, and you get the chords of a circle for that. Likewise through this. There is no way to go to the higher geometry from the chords. There's absolutely no way to do it. And I've seen a lot of people try it. So you look at that, and you look at Schenker, he screwed up by chords. And then there was another guy in this century who said he was going to rescue modern music. His name was Hindemith. And he said he was so dedicated to music as a science, he wrote a piece on the life of Kepler. It's called Matis de Mahler. But he says Kepler discovered the chord. And then he goes, and then he tries to show increasing dissonance. And he shows that a great piece of music goes through dissonance and resolve, but in terms of chords. And he proves that Schoenberg is an idiot and that Wagner's a great composer. But see, this stuff is what allowed Schoenberg to do what he did. Because Schoenberg came out and said, he wrote a book on this kind of harmony. And he came out and he said, well, all the chord progressions that can be written have been written. There's a finite number of chord progressions. They've all been written. Therefore, we must liberate the music and start doing other things. We must liberate, emancipate the dissonance, and we're not going to have any tones dominating other tones. This is fascinating. He made a law that says every tone has to get its turn before you use it again. That's the law. Jack of the fashions. But that's, he couldn't have got away with that otherwise. He really couldn't have got away with it. But I remember when I was in school and they made us do these little, they told us to compose something in the classical style. And my teacher looked at me and he said, no, just remember before you do this, everything that can be said has been said. And Bertrand Russell said the same thing about mathematics, didn't he? I mean, these guys really had an operation to say that, this had all been done. I remember the point at which I decided to get the hell out of there and join the labor committees. This is when my composition teacher looked at me and he said, this really doesn't tell us anything about how the music is composed. And me being naive, I said, it doesn't. Why don't we study it? And, when musicians don't want to answer a question, they start doodling at the piano. Now, but let's point out one thing. Okay, now where do the chords come from? All right, listen, look at the top line. It's all the same chord. Please put it back to the original theme. the second thing? Oh no, leave it at the original thing. The bass line is really funny. There's a lot to be said about this. C, C, right? So it's C, G, C, G, C, D, 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 D. Now put it back to that first variation.
With or without the garbage?
What's that?
With or without the?
Without the garbage.
Okay. Is this over?
Let me do this first while it's fresh in people's mind. Let me just play the bass line here. So take that first line, C, G, and the next part was D. So you see, he's having a lot of fun with the Haydn principle. Every single little snippet of this theme gets varied in some way, in a very ironic kind of fashion. And that's where the chords come from. They come from that kind of motion. They get, but in terms of development of ideas and pedal point. But to say that each one of these is a separate chord. Entirely obscures it. So go ahead, say what you're going to say with the registry.
You want me to?
Okay. But you can always find that. It's out of developmental ideas that the chords come. There's one piece. There's one part later where he gets these real wild chords like this. But that's all based on this. Listen to the top part of it. Variation on that idea from the theme, and not a series of chords. Anyhow, it's 7 o'clock, so I think rather than say any more, I should just throw it open to questions. Anybody's got any?
Yes. Drones. I just wanted to say something or get your reaction on something about drones. The instrument that Leonardo da Vinci played was an instrument that had 2 drone strings on it, and then the rest of them were polyphonic strings.
What was it?
It was called the lira da braccio. It's supposed to be one of the antecedents to the violin. Although it was mainly used to recite or sing poetry and accompany oneself with it. There's almost no written music for it because it was improvisational. But there must have been some way that they were able to use these. You have 2 free strings, so they could not be. You couldn't put your fingers down and change the pitch on it, and then you have 5 strings that you could change the pitch.
Right.
That's just an observation for you to think about. But I wanted to mention that in Liamod, which you showed, that yet another quality that goes against the whole idea of absolute music comes in, which is a representational quality because Schubert is imitating a drone instrument, the hurdy-gurdy, right?
Yeah.
By Schenker's criteria, and Schumann does that in some lieder and so on, where they actually try to, like a painter would introduce a subject, right? There's a subject there that doesn't come from the poem as such, does not fit into absolute music, is evocative, adds yet another dimension of expression, which is completely outlawed by this notion of absolute music, right? Of course, the interesting question is how he plays around with that. Despite he has this fixed pedal point, but aside from what you said about wanting to create that haunting, sad quality, he also actually wants to paint a picture of a hurdy-gurdy.
Yeah, right.
So.
Yeah.
Does, in the Ramovian system, does that create or does it predate or postdate the use of the loss of a fixed dough? It seems to me to imply that the dough is.
The dough is movable.
Yeah.
Oh, it's definitely a movable dough system. He wrote it the same year as Bach wrote the well-tested classical clavier, 1722. And there actually is a statement from Kernberger, who's a student of Bach, saying, and Emmanuel Bach, saying, me and my father reject Rameau. And you can put us down for that. And they never told us that in college either. They never did. Because if Bach had rejected it, I think, a few other people might have done so as well. So it was a big effort to promote this thing. It really was.
Because the fixed dough is an integral part of possibility of
Sure.
development.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. But this thing, see, chords do exist and figure-based deals with them, but as ephemerals and basically as particular cross-section of horizontal action. When you get this fixation on the root and everything, you really are verticalized. And when you have to think about the root of everything, you can't think about the pedal point because it's like an irrational series of pedal points. If I ever played you one of these root series, it would sound completely irrational. And that's what you begin to think, that becomes substituted for it. I think that is one of the large reasons why this notion of pedal points. If you think of what's beautiful about this series, and what Lynn's, everything that Lynn has identified, the register shift, the vocalization of the vowel formings and these pedal points, is something in which there is no comprehension whatsoever in any theory book that you might go and get. You might have screwed up versions of other things, but there's no discussion of this stuff anyway.
Yeah, I mean, people listen, if you've ever heard Rameau's music, what it really is the 18th century equivalent, 17th century equivalent, 18th, of what we used to call folk music in the 1960s. And it is, at first it sounds pretty, and then you realize that they've totally abandoned any dissonance. There's no dissonance anywhere. It's a melody with chords played under it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it actually could describe his music probably fairly well. And it's also, he was around the circles of Rousseau.
Probably find some of the exact same pieces being played, very minor variations.
He also was not a very well-known composer. It was a real promotion job to promote Rameau, because of this harmony.
Yeah, I just wanted to, if you could put the back on the screen the first prelude from the well-tempered clavier. I just wanted to come back to a point in that, which is this issue of the difference between shifting the pedal point and actually changing the key. I think it's actually worth a certain amount of attention because I think, in part, it's actually very interesting. I mean, there are definitely identifiable methods that Bach approached these things with. Recently, I was looking at a lot of four-part chorales for various reasons, and
Can I say something real quick just about the registration and the ability if we change it for 1 second? Because the point about the C and the G is very simple. These are notes that are in 2 different registers. And the fact that you go through that what is done in these conservatories today is to completely ignore that fact, and it's going to come up in what you're about to mention this, people are really not actually interrupting you, because the reason that the composers are focusing on these things when they're writing these pedal points is that they are thinking of these things in terms of the shift in the singing voice. And could you just play just the bass of this so that people can hear it? A pedal point like this, the only reason that he's thinking of changing from the C to the G has to do with the human registration. And you do see that in the prelude also.
which part did you want to?
Well, the thing, in terms
Right where
of,
the F sharp comes in?
well, getting back to this question of what the character is of this hypothesis you had about the D, I mean, I just wanted to make one general observation. We don't have the actual music here. But I was noticing that when he writes these 4-part chorales for cantatas, that he sets himself, he does it according to a kind of plan right from the beginning. I mean, I wish I don't have the music with me, but what he does is that, because they're very condensed and they're very brief, he has an idea right from the beginning that what he's going to emphasize is the major-minor relationship. Here's something which is, only 16 measures long, or 12 measures long, yes, and it has to be relatively simple. So rather than going straight to the fifth, he emphasizes the major-minor relationship as sort of that's sort of the guiding framework. Also, the idea that Bach sometimes uses key changes which are only implicit, or pedal point changes which are implicit, is rampantly the case. I mean, he was a master at that kind of thing. But I just wanted to point out. Actually, it's not in this one. It's in the other, not the prelude. The invention. Yeah. That it's just interesting that I was trying to think about the question of where does it come in, and very often also the change occurs at the point that you get a tritone in a cross voice, and that's exactly what you have in measure 1, 2, 3, 4, measure 5. We have the F sharp and the bass and the C natural.
Well, actually, that goes on for several measures. The F sharp and the C are playing against each other all
Right,
the time.
but that very, very often, that is the form in which this implicit thing, this implicit relationship takes place. It's at the point that you get the playing off of that kind of tritone relationship, that in a cross voice relationship, that such an implicit. That's it's a way of representing. It's a way of representing a change of pedal point, a change of either by doing it or by not doing it. But for him, it has that kind of representational.
Well, Lynn, last week Lynn was talking about the transcendental in terms of the circle, and in terms of contours, transfinite, and metaphors having that quality in poetry. And he referred to in music as the distance, and he gave the example of the type of distance typified by C to F sharp. What I find fascinating about this is it's not just in terms of a couple notes on the page, but it's an actual region where the key becomes, you don't actually know what key you're in. You're moving from one to another, and there's actually a region in which you're sort of in one, you're sort of in another, and you're not sure. There's an ambiguity to it. And I'd say again, you think these Shakespeare sonnets. I mean, the funny thing is, the irony and ambiguity is far more precise than any kind of literal statement can ever be. And Shakespeare's a master of it. And I think that's a light went on in people's head when we actually went through that key change, and you kind of heard this thing emerging out of nowhere. It's a different way of thinking about the dissonance, because if the dissonance really is, if that is transcendental, then you actually have to rigorously look at it that way and see how it functions. I think most of the problems in dissonance are real reductionist concepts of what dissonance is. So, John.
Well, I just want to point out with respect to this that also there's also a second ambiguity in that, the point at which it actually gets back to gets to G, like in measure in the third system,
Right.
Especially the second measure of the third system. Right. You could really say that he compares G, and you're almost, especially when you get that dum dum dum, that right there. Right. That could be, you could almost hear that as already G.
Yeah.
Even though it's upward. I just wanted to add one a potential a way of possibly explaining what Nora brought up about these older instruments, which, even though she's not here, I'll mention to her later, is that I think some of these drone strings in these older instruments should be looked at from the same standpoint that Beethoven began to look at the drums, and where you just had 2 or mostly 3 drums as a way of punctuating poetically certain sections of the piece and certain changes. And a fascinating study is to see Beethoven's use of exactly the same 2 drums or 3 drums tuned in exactly the same way, and then he'll do a modulation. in such a way that then the drums are not do so do, but they're like mi la mi or something, la mi la or
So the
something.
Ninth Symphony is beautiful with that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It completely changes and I would bet the way that the drum strings would be used, and that would be something similar to that,
Yeah,
rather than being played constantly. Or
That would
something.
make, yeah, that's the only way I can see it.
In most of those old instruments, I don't know that specific one, they were not tuned to just one note, they were tuned to two different notes, usually the tonic and the fifth below. And that already gives you the possibility for change, which is not in those Indian instruments, because they can be used to punctuate the modulations.
Anybody else have a question? Oh, we got Chuck.
That were good. Who's in charge of the tape?
Yeah.